Margaret Harlow sat quietly at the far end of the long dining table, her hands resting one over the other, as if she were holding herself together by habit alone. Around her, the room was alive. Voices overlapping, glasses clinking, laughter spilling freely into the air. Yet none of it seemed to reach her. It felt as though she was separated from the celebration by an invisible wall, watching life move forward without her participation. The chandelier above cast a warm golden light across polished wood and expensive fabrics, but it did nothing to warm her chest. She had learned over many years that warmth does not always come from surroundings. Sometimes it leaves slowly, unnoticed, until one day you realize it is gone for good. Edward, her husband of nearly 5 decades, stood proudly near the center of the room, surrounded by guests who admired him, praised him, and spoke of his success as though it had appeared from nowhere. They laughed at his stories, nodded at his words, and treated him like a man who had built everything on his own strength. Margaret watched him carefully, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity. She knew every step that had brought him here, the nights he came home exhausted, the doubts he whispered into the darkness, the failures no one else ever saw. She had been there for all of it, quietly filling the gaps, smoothing the edges, holding things together while remaining unseen. The woman standing beside Edward was younger, graceful in a way that demanded attention without effort. Her smile was practiced, confident, and her laughter arrived at just the right moments, slightly louder than necessary. When Edward spoke, she looked at him as if he were extraordinary, as if the past had never existed before her arrival. Margaret noticed how Edward leaned slightly toward her, how his hand rested comfortably at her back, familiar in a way that did not belong to a passing moment. It was not shock that settled in Margaret's chest. It was confirmation. She had sensed this shift long before anyone dared to name it. Their marriage had not collapsed in a single moment. It had faded gradually, like ink exposed too long to sunlight. Years ago, Edward had begun speaking less, sharing fewer thoughts, making decisions without consulting her. At first, Margaret told herself it was stress, then responsibility, then success. She believed loyalty meant patience, and patience meant endurance. She never raised her voice, never demanded explanations, never forced conversations that felt uncomfortable. She thought silence would protect what remained between them, not realizing that silence can also bury what is still alive. The celebration continued, and eventually Edward raised his glass, signaling for attention. The room grew quieter, eager to hear him speak. Margaret felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from knowing, the kind of knowing that arrives when all the pieces finally align. Edward spoke about change, about new beginnings, about choosing happiness when life offers it. His words were smooth, carefully chosen, and warmly received. Then he introduced the woman beside him. Applause followed immediately, loud and enthusiastic, filling the space where Margaret's entire history should have been acknowledged. She remained still, her face calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment while everyone else was still inside it. No one looked at her. Not a single guest paused to wonder how it felt to sit through such an announcement after a lifetime of shared years. Margaret felt no urge to cry, no desire to protest. What surprised her most was the peace settling quietly over her thoughts. The end, she realized, did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with clarity. She understood then that this celebration was not meant for her, and that she no longer needed it to be. What they did not know, what none of them could see, was that Margaret had already prepared herself for this moment long before it arrived. When she finally stood, the movement was subtle, almost unnoticed. Her chair shifted softly against the floor, drawing a brief glance from Edward, more irritation than concern crossing his face. Margaret met his eyes and smiled, not out of bitterness, not out of defeat, but with the calm certainty of someone who has already made peace with an ending. She walked out of the room, without explanation, leaving behind the noise, the laughter, and the illusion that everything was still under control. The house felt strangely empty the next morning, though Edward could not immediately understand why. Margaret's absence was quiet, precise, complete. Her room was cleared, her belongings carefully removed, leaving no trace of haste or emotion. On the dining table lay an envelope addressed to him in her familiar handwriting. Inside, there were no accusations, no pleas, no anger, only truth, calmly stated, firmly grounded. She wrote of watching the celebration, of recognizing that her role in his life had already ended, and of choosing to step away with dignity rather than remain as a shadow. What followed unfolded, slowly but inevitably. Legal realities Edward had ignored came forward. Structures he assumed were secure revealed themselves to be shared, carefully balanced, and thoughtfully arranged. Margaret had never been careless. She had listened, remembered, and protected herself quietly, not out of malice, but out of wisdom earned over time. By the time Edward fully grasped what was happening, Margaret was already gone, not fleeing, not hiding, but living somewhere peaceful, free from the weight of being invisible. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no public collapse, just a man left to face the consequences of what he had overlooked, and a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies in leaving without noise. Margaret had watched them celebrate, knowing the end was near, and when it arrived, she was no longer there to witness the aftermath, because she had already chosen herself.